We have hockey tomorrow. Yeah. And there's a lot of talk about how Boston's 11 days in between games. Yeah. For St. Louis, it's been about a week. So, rust is a thing. I expect kind of a sloppy first 5 minutes, which could mean goals. Could mean we have goals, we have comebacks, maybe we get a lot of physicality out of it. I expect a very physical game from St. Louis, trying to push Boston out of the rink, sort of like they did with San Jose at the end of that series. That's just playoff hockey. Um, I would expect that they'll target Chara to some extent. Chara, who was out for the last game that they played against Carolina. I would expect some kind of a target on Chara, and maybe as well on Wagner, who had an injury in the last series as well. It's just, like I said, it's just playoff hockey. So St. Louis in against Boston. St. Louis coming off the 6-game series win over Winnipeg, 7 games over Dallas, and 6 games over San Jose. Boston, 7 games over Toronto, 6 games over Columbus, 4 games over Carolina. And I want to say just off the top, we can debate over who had a harder time getting here. You play who you play. And if a team didn't play against a contender that you're like, well, they didn't have to beat these guys. You know why? Because they lost to one of the other teams on the board. I don't understand that argument at all. It's absolutely, it's crazy to me. You can look and go, well, they only beat those teams. Well, yeah, but who did they beat? So it comes down to that, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of talk about sweep in favor of St. Louis. I don't see any magic formula here, but I thought I'd put the rosters on the board. Now, for St. Louis, you got Schwartz, Shen, Tarasenko. You match that up against Marchand, Bergeron, Pasternak. For me, I give that to the Bergeron line. No offense to St. Louis. Second line, Blais, O'Reilly, Perron against DeBrusk, Krejci, and Backes. If Backes is on that line and it's not Heinen, I honestly would favor St. Louis in that one. There's 1-1. Third line, Maroon, Bozak, and Thomas, or Johansson, Coyle, and Heinen. Or, as I said, Backes. That one's an interesting one in that Johansson and Coyle were both at it at the deadline. They've been really solid in the playoffs. Bozak's picking it up. Maroon's been playing well, and Thomas has quietly had a solid playoffs. I kind of see that as kind of a saw-off, but mild favoring of Boston in that, so I'll say like 1.5 to 1. Favor of Boston. Fourth line, Barbashev, Sundqvist, and Steen versus Nordstrom, Corrali, and Wagner. That is a saw-off. I can't pick, and if it's a Chari that's in the lineup, that's just fine as well. So, 1.5 point in favor of Boston so far on the matchup. Edmondson, Pietrangelo, Chara, McAvoy. I like Edmondson, Pietrangelo because I'm not 100% sold on Chara's health, so that gives a 1.5 point advantage to St. Louis. Bouwmeester, Parayko, Krug, and Carlo. I'll say saw-off on that one, and I know St. Louis fans aren't going to like it, but Krug and Carlo were fantastic throughout that last series. Carlo balances things out nicely because Krug is kind of scary as a defensive player 5-on-5. Dunn and Gunnarsson versus Grzelcyk and Clifton. I would probably give that to St. Louis. So 1.5 in favor of St. Louis. Rask versus Bennington. I would give the advantage to Rask. So if you're just looking at a player-by-player, just off the top of my head kind of thing, I would give kind of a small advantage to St. Louis. Boston has the advantage of having played more playoff games. They have the more experience. But in reality, this is a very, very close series. On paper, these teams are very close. Now, one thing I will say, and people are going to take that point system and say, wait a minute. Now, yes, if this first line of Marchand, Bergeron, and Pasternak get off to a really good start, and if they score the way they can, it is enough to overwhelm a lot for St. Louis. There have been games in these playoffs where that's been the only line going for Boston, and it's the only one they've needed. And there have been games where their fourth line, third line, second line, where every line has won the game for them. But St. Louis has had that as well. Schen's had a quietly solid playoffs, not scoring as many points as he'd probably like, but he's been pretty darn solid. Now, special teams, that favors Boston on paper. St. Louis, 19.4% on the power play, 78% on the penalty kill. Boston, 34% power play, 86.3% on the penalty kill. So those numbers favor the Bruins. Face-off percentage, 49.4% for St. Louis, 53.3% for Boston. You can make the argument that St. Louis faced off against better centers in their 3 series than did Boston. But again, a lot of it's going to come down to Bergeron and how he does in the face-off circle. If he has an easy time of it, in any given game or throughout this series against an O'Reilly or a Shen in the faceoff circle, this could really favor Boston quickly. I anticipate a close game. Like I said, watch those first 5 minutes. Watch for some rust. I would say on both teams because of the layoff. There's been a lot of hype around both teams. There's been a lot of interviews and a lot of talk. A lot of people saying, oh, St. Louis are going to win. A lot of people saying Boston are going to win. I am not saying anything other than I favor Boston in this, and it's not because I cheer for them. It's because I genuinely think, man for man, line for line, they are probably the better team. But notice I'm just saying probably. This is going to be close. And I really think this is going to be fun. Now, of course, this is going to be the playoff board, so I got the St. Louis mini magnets down here to count off the goals. The Boston mini magnets down here to count off the goals. I have not needed more than 6 for Boston for quite a while. I do have 7 on the board for St. Louis. I'll probably drop it to 6 because it's the Stanley Cup final. The odds of a game actually having 7 goals in it are pretty slight, especially with how well these teams have been playing defensively over the last couple of rounds. St. Louis, of course, they are favored when a game is low scoring. If a game is 2-1, 1-0, that'll probably be a St. Louis game. But the trick with Boston is whatever you want to do, Boston can hang. The one thing is, if the game gets really, really physical, I think it favors St. Louis. So if St. Louis is able to push their weight around a little bit early on in this series, that'll be their advantage. What Boston has to watch out for is St. Louis, of course, deadly in the playoffs, and they've been fantastic on the road throughout. So Boston needs to assert themselves at home and say, all right, we're pretty good at home in these playoffs, and we're going to be pretty good at home against you guys. I anticipate a lot with this. This is going to be fun. And again, it doesn't matter to me who wins at this point. This is just it's fun to see this, and it is great for St. Louis. So if the Blues win, it would be very nice to see a championship go to the St. Louis Blues after all these decades of frustration and all these decades of a lot of things thrown at St. Louis in terms of them being chokers and this and that and all that. I don't really buy into that. And then what it does is it puts other teams on the clock when it comes to, oh, well, now that St. Louis has won one, when's it your turn? And that definitely changes that focus. And it would be kind of a fun underdog story for a team that was last in the league in January, and now they could very well be on the verge of a Stanley Cup victory. That being said, let me know what you guys think, who you guys are picking for tomorrow. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happen upon this video, and hey, I am wearing the jersey that Boston wore the last time that they played St. Louis in the Stanley Cup final. I'm leaning towards wearing this and, of course, the St. Louis throwback third during this Stanley Cup final series as a throwback to the last time these teams met in the Stanley Cup finals. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for all your support, and I'll talk to you again soon.